We are grateful for your co-sponsorship, generosity, and sharing your resources with us. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the quality and expertise of our featured speakers today. Although they are quite different, they do have important similarities. They are all alumni graduates and participating faculty at the VCU Department of Gerontology. They all have extensive experience in their fields of practice, and they all are compassionate educators who are excited to share their knowledge with all of us today. Today, our speakers will be talking about our elders, their life journey, their families, and their support circles. Our agenda will begin with Dr. Jenny Inker, followed by Ellen Phipps, and concluding with Enid Butler. Following each speaker's presentation, we'll have a question and answer segment for 15 minutes. I encourage you to jot down your questions as each speaker goes through their slides and use the question and answer feature box at the bottom of your Zoom window to send them to us. For those who previously sent your questions by email, we appreciate you doing so ahead of time. Before we begin, it is important to recognize that what we're about to examine is complex, heavy emotionally, and uncertain. As Maya Angelou said, hope and fear cannot occupy the same space. Invite one to stay. On that note, I turn the stage over to Jenny to begin our webinar. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I am so happy to be here. Thank you, Karen, for that introduction. It's great to be with you today. And we're going to start today by walking through the door of self, which is something that we like to do at VCU Gerontology. It's really part of the whole way that we teach gerontology. And so today I'm going to be talking about us and not them, because we're all aging. And this is about all of us. And so I can connect with you a little more personally. I'd like to share something up front. I turned 58 years old this year, and I feel every one of those years, but not in the way that you might think. I am thrilled to be on my life's journey. I'm thrilled to have amassed 58 years of life experience, and I'm already trying to live more like an elder every day by slowing down, by deepening my perspective, and connecting more with who I am than what I do. But none of that is easy, because nothing in our society supports us behaving this way. But there are role models we can emulate. And I want to start by reading you a very brief poem by a poet named Mary Oliver, who sadly died in 2019. I was introduced to Mary Oliver by Dr. Ann Welliford at VCU Gerontology in a psychology of aging class when I heard her read this poem. And I want to read it to you and have you keep this in the back of your mind as we go through this presentation this afternoon. This is called The Summer Day by Mary Oliver. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper. I mean the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? So, with that in the back of our minds, let's talk about ageism and let's think about what ageism is in this era of COVID-19. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about elderhood and what that has to do with all of this. So ageism, most people would say, well, this is bias against people based on their age. And that would be a simple explanation of it. But in fact, the concept is really surprisingly complex. There's all kinds of things baked into ageism. For instance, it can be negative, which is how we often think of it and how we'll talk about it today, but it can be positive. We've all are aware of programs like Social Security and Medicare. Some of us get senior discounts, and Those are examples of positive ageism. So it can run both negatively and positively. Today we'll be focusing much more on the negative aspects of ageism. It can also be internalized. In other words, we can do it to ourselves. We can be ageist toward ourselves as well as othering old people. It also has to do with what we think. In other words, the stereotypes, the generalizations, if you like, that we form about elders. It has to do with what we feel, whether that might be anxiety or fear or disgust at the thought of getting older or of being older or of old people, and also what we do. And you'll see any trip down the birthday card aisle in the grocery store will show you what age discrimination looks like, because many birthday cards are incredibly rude, and we simply wouldn't tolerate them if they were about people's race or their gender, but we tolerate it with regard to age. So ageism is something that we like to think of as hiding in plain sight. We also experience ageism at an individual level, intrapersonally in terms of inside ourselves, interpersonally, we spread it amongst each other, which I'll talk about in a bit, but it also appears at the organizational and societal levels. There is a lot of cultural messaging that involves ageism. So before we go further, I'd just like you to take this opportunity to pause a moment. Remember that we're coming in through the door of self. So in the privacy of your own mind and your own heart, I'd like to ask you to ask yourself these questions without any fear that anyone's going to judge you for being a bad person in terms of how you would honestly answer these. And I want you to consider, when you think about these questions, that sometimes ageism has been called a prejudice against our feared future self. This is something we fear becoming older many times, or many of us, if we don't fear it, have some anxiety around it. So likely any negative perceptions that we have about elders start somewhere inside us. Now, ageism, we would say to you at VCU Gerontology, is not a nice thing to do, and that would be a reason not to do it. So there's a moral case, there's an ethical case, but there's also a rock solid public health case for why we shouldn't be ageist. And here is just a brief summary of the research that's occurred in recent years, but research stretches back over the past half century. And so we know that when people have a more negative attitude to their own aging, they have an increased risk for chronic disease, and they perceive their own health to be worse. We have studies that show that when people are infantilized in long-term care situations and treated as if they are not fully adults, it increases their level of dependency and decreases their independence. And there have been two fascinating sets of longitudinal studies that have worked, studied people over decades and found that people who earlier in their lifespans had a more negative attitude to growing older, when they had something serious happen like a heart attack or a stroke, they actually recovered more slowly and less completely than people who decades earlier had a positive attitude to their own aging. And I think the most startling study that I've seen is one done in 2016 that found that people who earlier in their lifespans had a more positive attitude to their own aging actually showed lower presence of Alzheimer's biomarkers than people who had a more negative attitude. So we're not saying that having a negative attitude to your age causes you to have Alzheimer's disease biomarkers, but there's some kind of correlation there. We also know that ageism is costly. It's really not good for healthcare. And there was, again, a very recent study that looked at this. They tried to put an economic cost on ageism because we know money talks. And so it's a sort of an interesting approach, but they calculated that the additional health costs of ageism were $63 billion a year. And what they did was they surveyed a whole bunch of people and basically arranged them into four groups: a group of people who had negative attitudes to their own aging, a group of people who felt they had been negatively stereotyped by others on the basis of their age, a group who said they had experienced direct age discrimination, and a group who said they didn't feel affected by ageism at all. And people in the first three groups that either felt ageism within themselves or felt that they were the targets of ageism by others, they had higher healthcare costs than the fourth group who said that they didn't experience age discrimination. And the researchers thought is that there's probably some kind of stress impact from the experience of feeling discriminated against that actually worsens health. So the researchers also in this study, they controlled for differences that might have been caused by age and sex. And so they felt pretty confident that this number was really real, that there were these additional healthcare costs as a result of ageism. But perhaps even more shockingly, we know that people who hold negative age stereotypes and who have more negative attitudes to their own aging live on average 7 years less than people with positive attitudes to their own aging. So that would be like me taking up smoking as a habit and smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, which I wouldn't do. And therefore, you know, it's a reasonable question. Should we really look inside ourselves and think about those 3 questions that I just asked you to think about in your heart and your mind? What are your attitudes to aging? Because I know what I could do with 7 extra years, and it makes me think of The Summer's Day, the poem that I just read you. I could spend 7 years in a field with grasshoppers. We also know from research at VCU Gerontology that ageism is bad for business. This is a study done by our colleagues, Dr. Gendron, Welliford, Palco, and Myers, and they found that people who are working with elders, and principally in long-term care settings, but in other settings in the aging network, that where these individuals had greater anxiety about their own aging, their job satisfaction was lower and their likelihood of staying in their job was lower. So you can see here some really concrete, real world impacts of ageism. So ageism isn't simply not a nice thing to do, not a moral thing to do. It is actually concretely harming us in terms of our businesses and our health. And so we need to be concerned about this. It is a real world issue. Now let's frame it in terms of the era of COVID-19. And what I would say to you is, ageism is not new. It is a pan-cultural phenomenon that is it's experienced all over the world. There are no cultures that are immune from it. It's been here all along, but COVID-19 has really ramped up its impacts, and it's also shone a light on it so that we can see what was there. It was always there, but the light is shining on it and we can see it more easily now. It's been, I think, oftentimes in our society, very easy to overlook ageism. It's been very hard recently because it's been pushed into our face. So let's think about what some of these impacts are. So at this personal level, I would say that some of the things we've seen in terms of the impacts of COVID-19 is that there's this perception that elders are sitting ducks. They're these vulnerable and helpless people that are being picked off by this ravaging pandemic, which targets them specifically. And so there's this high level of fear about this. At the same time, there's often this general assumption that high mortality rates among elders are inevitable. It's normal. All those people in nursing homes that died, well, they were frail, they were old, they were gonna die anyway, right? I mean, there is this ugly kind of assumption trading in the ether, really. And it could be that younger people in some cases have felt that this is not something that particularly impacts them, or they see themselves as invulnerable or less vulnerable to COVID-19. And that may have affected some people's willingness to follow public health guidelines that protect everybody. At a political level, we've heard some really chilling comments about elders and COVID. Things like elders should sacrifice themselves to the economy and should sacrifice themselves for the sake of younger generations, which is a bizarre statement. And it's built on some assumptions. If we really stop for a moment and we get over our sense of moral outrage, how could somebody say something like that? And then start to think this through, well, what are they assuming when they say that elders should sacrifice themselves for the economy? Well, first of all, I think there's an assumption that all elders are the same, that to be old is to be old, right? And there's no variation within there. But let's consider this. If we take the age 65, which is the one of those gateway ages, from which you start to become eligible for these state entitlements. So let's say that's the entree to old age. I mean, I think we could argue whether there is a chronological gateway, but let's just say for the sake of my argument that 65 is the gateway. Well, people can live to over 100. So we're talking about 4 decades. And surely there are tremendous differences between somebody who is in their 60s and somebody who is over 100 or somebody who is in their 80s. So there's a huge diversity, first of all, in the older population. And we know from COVID-19 data from Italy that the death rate of people in the age range 60 to 69 is about 3 to 4%. When you compare it to Italians who were 80 or older, it goes up significantly, it goes up to 20%. So lots of variation there. There's also some bedrock assumption here that elders don't contribute to our economy. And I think if we think about that for even just a moment, we're going to realize that's just not true, right? First of all, a large amount of the discretionary income in the United States is actually held by older people. And we have a consumer economy and older people participate actively in that. But there are other ways in which they participate. Tens of thousands of retired healthcare workers have returned to the workforce, heeding a call to volunteer their time to help because of the pressure on health systems due to COVID-19. So we've had lots and lots of elders come back into the workforce and volunteer their time. We also know that elders are primary caregivers for over a third of older adults. The spouse is the primary caregiver. Nearly 2 million elders care for their grandchildren, and a full 1/4 of all children under 5 whose parents work are cared for by a grandparent. These people are supporting our economy by doing this. And then there's the really ugly assumption that younger lives have more value than older lives. And I will say, fortunately, for the most part, age hasn't been widely adopted as a criterion for allocating scarce healthcare resources, say like ventilators, for instance. But there are frameworks that do use age in allocating these scarce resources. And so age is sometimes being used as a tiebreaker. In other words, if 2 people in an ICU have an equal chance of surviving the intensive care treatment and getting well, then age may be considered a tiebreaker in that the thought is, well, we want to give equal opportunity to people to experience different life stages. And if I'm 58 and I need the ventilator and you're 28 and you need the ventilator, well, I've had my years, you haven't had all of your years yet, so I should step aside for you. And while sure we can understand the logic, perhaps, of using age as a tiebreaker, I'm sure you can see the problem here that it's a pretty slippery slope, and that can easily translate into a misunderstanding that this is some kind of reflection of an individual's worth and utility, that I'm not as useful to society because I'm 58 and you're 28. So we don't want to pit people against each other like this, but we'll talk a little bit more about how and why that happens. That has been happening. And then there's the structural level. And here more than ever, my message is the structural problems that COVID-19 has exposed were already there. And let's just take long-term care as an example. Elders living in long-term care and the staff who serve those elders in long-term care are among the most marginalized people in our society. And this is shocking. This is sad. These are staff who do not earn a living wage and probably never had for the most part, unless they're really at the top of the structure in long-term care. There's been gross under-resourcing of long-term care for many years. And we see this now when the system is really put under pressure in that long-term care communities don't have adequate personal protective equipment for staff and for residents to keep everybody safe. They don't have adequate funding to regularly test residents and staff. And then on top of all of this misery, you have the way the media has approached and covered COVID-19 in long-term care. And you may or may not have noticed this about the media coverage, but I think once I share this with you, you may begin to notice it and see that it's hard to unsee it. Like all ageism, once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. You'll see it everywhere. But media reports of younger individuals who have died of COVID-19 complications have often been in-depth reports about them and their life and a picture of them, maybe some video of them. Whereas we have seen the deaths of thousands of elders simply counted and summarized with no stories about who they were, if indeed the numbers are documented at all. So COVID really has simply shone a light on what was already there. So I hinted before that one of the issues we may have here is this pitting of ourselves against each other. And so I want to talk very briefly about what a generation is, because we commonly bandy about generational comparisons, and we love to talk about boomers and millennials and Gen Z. And so a generation is a social group that shares a common point in time. And this is because they were born around the same time, right? And so generational cohorts or generations, all they do is provide a lens that we can look through to understand how different formative experiences, say like big world events, how those affected cohorts of individuals who were born around the same time. The problem is that we typically conflate age and cohort, and we do this wrongly. And I'm going to explain to you now why that's wrong and why that's problematic. So generational stereotyping, I'm going to give you an example. So there is this assumption, I don't know if you've heard it, I've heard it very commonly, elders are frugal. Old people are frugal, right? They don't like to waste money. And I would say to you, for anyone who's really old now, who would have been a child during the 20s and the 30s when there was a very deep depression in the United States, will have been marked for life by that experience, if it was a bad experience for their family, which it wasn't for everybody. Some people were okay, but many people were not. And so that kind of experience could lead to a lifelong frugality that has nothing to do with being old. It has to do with having had that experience at a formative time in your life. And I have thought, actually, when all the toilet paper disappeared, and in Williamsburg, Virginia, the toilet paper disappeared. And I wasn't ready for that. I didn't know that was going to happen. It was slow off the mark when it did happen. And so whenever toilet paper became available, I was always hunting for it. And I began to develop this little hoarding habit with toilet paper. I mean, I didn't have a lot, but anytime I could get my hands on a roll, I would buy it. And I've often thought, like, when I'm really old, will I maybe still hoard a little toilet paper because this experience really marked me? And then will young people think, oh, wow, look at all these old people, they hoard toilet paper. Huh, that must be something to do with being old. Old people hoard things, they hoard toilet paper. No, it just has to do with me being marked by an experience that toilet paper disappeared off the shelves. So we want to be careful not to conflate age and cohort, or age and generation. And unfortunately, in this era of COVID-19, there have been significant attempts to drive a wedge between generations. That, by the way, is something that was also already happening. That had been happening too, just we're seeing the light shining on it. And you hear it in these things like COVID-19 is a boomer remover. Boomers are a drain on society, and COVID-19 just handily removes them. Isn't that great? But you also hear stereotypes at the other end of the lifespan. Younger millennials and Gen Z, they're feckless, they're careless, they only think about themselves, they only want to party on the beach, they don't care if anybody else gets COVID. And so what you hear happening here is we are taking huge groups of people and generalizing and saying, I know you, I know what you're like, and what you're like isn't very nice. But let me ask you this, let's take the boomer generation. That is people born between the years 1946 and 1964 of all races and social classes. How can these people all be the same? How can all millennials be the same? How can all Gen Z be the same? They can't be, right? And I would just like you to think too about boomers, right? Boomers come in for a lot of criticism now, but one thing that was, when boomers were young, one of the taglines that boomers would say about themselves is never trust anybody over 30, right? So it's like, this is like a mistake that we carry across generations, that we do this generational stereotyping. So I urge you, whenever you hear it, or maybe even find yourself engaging in it, think, I can be more person-centered than this. I can think about individuals. Okay, let me come back to the issue of ageism here and the cycle of relational ageism, because there is actually something in the ether here with ageism. And so I would say there's a dominant cultural narrative, which basically is, it is good to be young, it is bad to be old. And you can see some of these magazine covers tell us that we should want to look younger, we should want to be younger, or we should want to do that instantly. And so we absorb this from the cultural ether, if you like. This gets inside us, and then we share it with one another in social interactions because we crave connection with one another. And I'm going to show you now what this looks like. Just a reminder to you, this is about all of us, right? A little solidarity message. So we learn about aging everywhere, from this cultural narrative, from the institutions in our society, in the social interactions we have, and also we learn about what's inside us, which is what I asked you to do right at the beginning. So let's just look at some of these for a moment. These are some examples of internalized ageism. These are examples we have collected from real people. These actually come from elders that we have done research with at VCU Gerontology. So there's still so much to learn even at my age. Sounds like quite an innocent comment. Actually, what's baked into that is this assumption that I wouldn't still be able to learn anything at my age. A kind of surprise, wow, I can still learn something even at my age. And how about I'm not old, I'm just more mature? We call that a Band-Aid word, more mature. Why would you be afraid to say you're old? There's nothing wrong with being old. It's neither good nor bad. It's just neutral. It's a descriptor. But in our cultural messaging, we have learned that it's bad to be old. And so we don't prefer people to call us old. How about this one? This one came from somebody presenting at the White House Conference on Aging in 2015. He was up speaking at the podium, and he mentioned his wife who was about to turn 65, and then he caught himself and said, oh, she's going to be really upset with me that I just revealed her age on national television. Why? Why would there be anything shameful about being 65 or 85 or 95? How about this? It's my birthday and you tell me happy 29th birthday again, but you know I'm 58, going on 59 next year. Or you don't look old, or you look great for your age. So we're trying to pay a social compliment here because, again, we've kind of slurped up that cultural messaging that says, hey, you know what? I can compliment you by telling you that you look younger. And when you think about how we talk about the whole aging population, we talk about it as a crisis. Why is it a crisis that there are more older people? We know that the proportion of elders is growing in our society. I see opportunity. I don't see crisis. And if you think about the anti-aging industry, I mean, that is just incredibly shame-ridden. That is basically saying you are unnatural. When aging is the most natural thing we could be doing, it's what we're all doing. So why would we want to reverse it? Why would we want to cover it up? I will tell you why that industry wants us to do that, because it makes them buku bucks. This is a huge industry and it's all based on shaming us. So what do we do about all of this? Well, at VCU Gerontology, we would advise you to do 3 things to begin with. First of all, to pause, slow down, think of the summer day. There's no need to go fast here. And remind ourselves, why are our attitudes to aging so important? Well, they're important because it's about our health, it's about our well-being, it's about the well-being of the whole society, it's about the well-being of the economy. And then we'd ask you to listen. Start to pay attention to the language that you use and the language that you hear other people use. When you begin to tune into it and you begin to listen for old means bad and young means good, you'll start to hear it everywhere. And then we'd say, learn. Because once you know better, you can do better. And I think that might be a Maya Angelou quote, but I've always loved that, right? Once you know better, you can do better. So we would say to you, let's disrupt ageism. And I'm going to give you some examples how. First of all, within yourself, just simply asking yourself these questions that I posed to you at the beginning. What do you think it means to be old? How do you feel about yourself as an aging person? And how do you talk about growing older? This is a beginning point for you to disrupt ageism that might be in yourself. And if it makes you feel any better, it's in all of us. We all have ageism in us. I don't think we can help it. I mean, I think it's human nature to have bias. But even a trained gerontologist, things still sometimes emerge from my mouth that I have to catch after they have already emerged. And I think, wow, that came from some really deep place. But so this isn't about being a good or a bad person, but it is about being an aware person. So we can disrupt by saying what we actually mean. this is a great place to start. So instead of saying, oh, you know, the crisis of the aging population or the aging crisis or the silver tsunami, and, you know, why would we call elders in our population, why would we equate them to a national disaster? I don't understand that at all. Well, what could we say instead? Why don't we just say the older population, the growing number of elders in our population? There's no need to add any kind of valence or value judgment to that. Let's just say what we mean. What about when we say somebody has a young spirit? Well, clearly that's a compliment, right? We're saying, well, this person is really vital and alive and zesty and has this thirst for life. Well, we can just say that. Wow, she's got such a zest for life. She's 98. She has such a zest for life. You don't need to use young as the default word for good. What about this? I feel so old. I feel about 100 years old today. We might say that. I think I have said things like that in the past. What do we mean? We mean we're tired. We mean we're fed up. We say this about other things. Oh, you know, that's old. It's getting old sitting on Zoom all day, right? Well, old is being used as the default word for bad. And so why don't we just say, I'm tired today. You know, I've spent a lot of time glued to Zoom and I've got Zoom eyes and Zoom butt and I've had enough. What about senior moment? We say that a lot sometimes when we've forgotten something. Oh, I'm having a senior moment. Well, actually, everybody forgets things. When you were 25 and you forgot your keys or what you walked into the next room for, you didn't think, oh, you know, I'm getting dementia or I'm having a senior moment or whatever. You thought, I forgot, or I'm tired, or I'm stressed, or whatever. So we need to think about our language because our language is a carrier of meaning and culture. And so what we say really does matter. All right, with the time that's left to me now, I just want to segue into elderhood and talk with you just a little bit about what elderhood is, because at VCU Gerontology, our view is this: if we don't want people to be ageist, then we need to have some suggestion for people about what we think would be better instead. So we don't feel it's sufficient to say, you know, just don't use these words. Just, you know, go and inspect yourself and your inner world and, you know, just stop being ageist. Well, where does that leave you? We feel like we all need more than that, right? Everybody needs a roadmap. So I want to talk to you just a little bit about elderhood. And let's think about what are the stages of our lives. Now, most of us would handily recognize that we have a childhood, we have adolescence, and we have adulthood. And I will say to you, these have not always been fixed in time. The ages at which you would transition into these life stages has not always been fixed. In fact, there has been a time where adolescence was not a recognized life stage, that people pretty much went from childhood straight into adulthood. So we have to think about these things as being socially constructed human beings. And so we socially construct our world. Basically, we make things up and say how they're going to be. And so we've now said that there is this thing called childhood, this thing called adolescence, and this thing called adulthood. And most of the society believes that we remain in adulthood until the end of our lives. At VCU Gerontology, we see something different. And we would say to you that there is another stage here that hasn't been named, although we're calling it elderhood, hasn't been named yet, but elderhood makes sense in terms of childhood and adulthood, kind of fits in that paradigm. But we see elderhood as being different from adulthood. Being old, being an elder, is more than being in your late adulthood. There are some distinct differences, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we think those are. This is Carl Jung. For those of you who have an interest in this kind of thing, he was a Swiss psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, and he was fascinated with the second half of life and what it was to be old. And he believed that the entire purpose of our lives was what he called individuation. That the entire purpose of our lives was to become our authentic individual selves in all of our glory. And he equated life stages to the times of day. So morning was youth, midday was midlife, and the afternoon of life was old age. And you'll see here that he said the afternoon of life is just as full of meaning as the morning, only its meaning and purpose are different. So he didn't have an expectation that we would spend the afternoon of our lives, our elderhood, if you like, doing the same things that we did in the morning of our life in our youth. And he believed that it was important for us to go within, to look inside ourselves. And so I guess you could say at VCU Gerontology, we probably have quite a Jungian approach because we want you to walk in through the door of self. But Carl Jung didn't think that we should spend the second half of our lives gazing at our navels and just contemplating our inner world. He felt that the importance of that inner journey was then to come back out and give back to our communities and society. And that is what we would call elderhood. And there are certain ways that our culture denies elderhood, if you think about it. Ageism is a huge denial of elderhood. We talk about us and them, us younger people and those older people, right? We serve them. They are dependent on us. And seeing ourselves as these two separate camps is truly problematic because we are all aging. And we always chuckle at VCU Gerontology when people talk about the aging population, meaning older adults, because the aging population is us. We're all aging. We've been aging from the moment we were conceived, and we'll be aging until the moment we die. And who knows what happens after that. So this is all of us. But in our society, we see us and we see them, and we see never the twain shall meet. And then when we layer on top of that, that to be them is not very good. That's the out group. We don't want to be old. We don't want to be seen as old. We don't want to look old. We fear becoming them. In our society, in our culture, we also value doing over being. Now, I grant you, we couldn't sit around being all day and doing nothing, or we wouldn't have an economy and, we wouldn't have a culture. So clearly there has to be some balance of doing over being. But think about what Mary Oliver was sharing with us in the summer day. She was talking about the huge value of being. And I think to prioritize being over doing means that we need to be able to slow down. And I was sharing with somebody the other day, one of the best things I've learned from my mother, I've learned it over the past couple of years. She's in her late 80s now. And spending a lot of time with her over the past couple of years, I've realized how slowly she moves, how slowly she does things, and how incredibly amazing that is. What a gift a day that is when you can move slowly and just really be deep and not be harried and harassed and have this hurry sickness that we all have. So our culture doesn't prioritize this, so it doesn't valorize it. And we get tapped on the wrist if we don't produce enough and we don't go fast enough. We also are desperately afraid of our existential vulnerability. And I think Enid is gonna talk to us about this too later on. And we don't wanna think about it. We don't wanna think about our death. We don't wanna think about our health declining. But these are very human experiences. And I would argue for a really full elderhood, we need to find a way of enveloping those into our sense of ourself without that crushing or overwhelming our sense of ourself. And part of the reason why that's so difficult is our culture prioritizes independence and fails to recognize the value of interdependence, which if you think about it, we are really interdependent. You didn't get where you are today, and neither did I, without a lot of people's help, and you don't stay there, and neither do I, without a lot of people's help. Every day people are helping us and we're helping each other, but it's not really fashionable for us to think about that so much. Our culture is really independence, and if you think about the long-term care industry, it trades on independence, it markets, which is, you think, because people go to long-term care because they are not independent. So we've made it, the good way to be is independent. And then people are ashamed and when they can't be independent, when in fact we've always been interdependent. The other thing we do culturally is we tell a single story about aging. And that single story typically is about the body, very much about the physical signs of aging. The whole anti-aging industry is preoccupied with this. And that's really, really problematic. I'm going to return to that point in just a moment. As I get close to wrapping up now, have you think on this, that aging people, every day we're aging, and we're all the ages we've ever been. So when somebody says, you know, I'm 58, but I still feel like I'm 28, my eyebrow goes up because I'm like, really? Because that's kind of like saying, you haven't gained anything in those intervening years. And surely you must have gained something in intervening years. I don't feel 20 anymore, but I remember what it was like to feel 28. And 28-year-old Jenny is still inside 58-year-old Jenny, right? So we're all the ages we've ever been. And I want to read a very brief poem by a poet, Lucille Clifton. She lived between 1936 and 2010, a really wonderful poet. And she wrote this very brief poem, which I feel like is a poem about elderhood. And it's called, I Am Not Done Yet. As possible as yeast, as imminent as bread, a collection of safe habits, a collection of cares. Less certain than I seem, more certain than I was, a changed changer. I continue to continue. What I have been most of my lives is where I'm going. And I think that's a beautiful encapsulation of this idea that we're like time travelers, right? The older we get, we can travel through our life experiences and including in the future. Like anyone who's ever looked into the future or daydreamed about the future is time traveling. So let's begin to wrap up here with this idea that we are multidimensional beings. There is no single story here. We have a body, a mind, a spirit, a soul, a social self. And we also grow, we adapt to changes, we maintain, and we experience loss. And we do all of those things all throughout the lifespan. I think the challenge is that culturally, our society has prioritized the body. And aging has become all about the body, when aging is actually a much more complex experience. And so as I end here, I want to say to you, there are many reasons to be hopeful. Although ageism is ugly and it's vile and it's rampant, there are genuine reasons to be hopeful. And I think for me, they revolve around our ability to push back and disrupt ageism by remembering that we are these multidimensional beings who experience this multi-directionality. And we can embrace that complex story. In fact, I argue that we should stop trying to simplify things and we should just embrace the complexity. We should stop trying to categorize people into one box or another, old or young, this or that, and start just really engaging with the true complexity of humanity. And I think by doing that, we can promote solidarity. We can promote a feeling that we're all in this together, that this is about all of us. And finally, let's remember, ageism is a social construct. Okay, everything people do is a social construct, meaning we've made it up. And that is really good news, because if we have made it up, we can unmake it and we can make it be something different. So I hope that you will think about these things, think deeply within yourself, and set out on your own journey, set out on your own elderhood journey. It's never too soon to start. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Karen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny. That was an amazing presentation, and I'm sure everybody is just thinking about the many things that you shared with us. There's a couple of things, the poems that you read, several people are interested in the sources, so if you could put that in the chat, that would be so helpful. And okay. There are some questions that I'll just start with the first one, and it reads as follows. Does ageism affect younger people, and how have you seen this play out with COVID-19?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So ageism is a lifespan phenomenon, Karen. So it's not just about old people. Young people are subjected to ageism quite frequently too. Sometimes ageism against younger people is called adultism, and it kind of trades off the idea that adults have a superiority over children and so treat children as if they don't know what they're doing. or can't be trusted. I think in terms of COVID-19, there's been really flagrant generational stereotyping that's been whipped up. The underlying generational stereotyping that was already there was Gen Z and the younger millennials are feckless, they don't care, they're not willing to work hard, all kinds of nasty generalizations that couldn't possibly hold true for an entire group of people. I mean, generalizations are interesting. Stereotypes usually have some kernels of specks of truth in them somewhere, but they can never hold across a whole group of people. So I think stereotyping young people as not caring about old people has been one of the ways in which they have been treated very badly around issues of COVID-19. And I think anytime any of us finds ourselves speaking in terms of a whole group and assigning behaviors and value judgments to a whole group, that's when we need to really pause, hit that pause button and say, hold up a minute, how could that be true? I'm talking about an entire generation of people. It's not possible that that would be true of all of these people. What we could say about a generation is that they would have experienced a big world event in a similar way. So, and I often wonder, say, about children who are relatively young now, what will this experience of the pandemic be like for them? It surely will be different compared to how their parents have experienced the pandemic or how elders have experienced the pandemic.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Another question is, how do you appropriately call others out on their ageism?
Wow. Okay. That is something I have personally struggled with. I am a person who hates confrontation. I never want to be seen as the smart alecky person. I hate feeling embarrassed. And I often feel like I'm going to easily embarrass myself. So situations like this have made me very nervous in the past. And I think everyone has to find their own way. But I think one of the things that's really worked for me is to, first of all, know that sometimes it feels appropriate to challenge somebody in the moment, and sometimes it doesn't. The moment may have to pass, and you may have to make a decision that you'll follow up and challenge the person later or in a different way, or you won't challenge them this time, but maybe you will next time. So the moment isn't always right. You know, maybe somebody says something ageist just as an important meeting is about to begin. And are you going to call the whole proceeding to a halt and say, excuse me, we need to talk about that comment? I mean, I've been in that situation where I haven't said anything. But then I've thought afterwards, okay, well, I do need to say something. How am I going to go about that? A lot of times, I think what I'm learning more and more and practicing more and more is that to see these as teachable moments. When somebody says something that sounds ageist to you, a really helpful response can be, tell me why you say that. I'm really interested in hearing that. Like if somebody were to say to me, oh, Jenny, you know, you turned 58 in June. Gosh, you look great for 58. I could say to them, that's interesting that you should say that. Tell me why you say that. What motivates you to say that to me in that way, right? And then you can understand what is in their head, because a lot of times we don't mean this, right? We have slurped up this cultural soup. It's in us, and it comes out in the most surprising ways. And maybe the best thing we can do is just give other people an opportunity to actually reflect on what they said. Because you don't want to be like the scold. I don't want to be the scold. Oh, here comes Jenny, the ageism police. You know, you can't say anything around her. She's really po-faced and she can't take a joke. And, you know, she'll be right on your back if you say anything at all. I don't want that relationship with people, but I do want people to have an opportunity to think and reflect on their attitudes to their own aging and to others.
Well, that response is sort of a segue into another question that's closely related, and here it comes. Is it realistic to expect that we could completely get rid of ageism?
No, not at all. I don't think so. I think bias is built into us. I think if you think about the way brains work, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but you know, the way our brains work, we categorize people, we recognize patterns. These things have led to our success as a species. They have been very helpful to us in terms of survival skills. It was important to distinguish, was this animal coming towards me dangerous or not? Do I recognize this from a previous experience? Should I be afraid here? Should I run? So we need to understand that our brains do these things for a reason. And I don't think we can expect to rewire our brains, but I think what we can do is expect to be more conscious. We can slow down, hit that pause button. Like if I have one message for everybody, it's slow down. I know nobody wants you to, and everyone thinks you should go faster. I want you to resist, slow down. There's no need to go so fast. And when you slow down, you can catch yourself. The number of times I've caught an ageist thought on the tip of my tongue before it plops out of my mouth, I can't even count. And I'm grateful for those times, because like, you don't need to look at yourself and like have an internal cleaning, you know, I am this unclean, bad ageist person. I've got to clean all that, you know, crap out of my closet. You just need to understand you're a human being. We're all human beings. We're frail and imperfect, and, you know, we're full of love and, you know, hate and all kinds of things, but we can be deliberate in what we say and what we do. We can choose to slow down and then and embrace a different way of talking about age and growing older.
We have time for one more question,
Okay.
and it's a good one to end on. What can I do to develop my own elderhood?
Again, that's a really individual path. It's going to be different for everybody, but I would say the first thing you can do is start now. Definitely start now. It's never too early. It doesn't matter what age you are. It's never too early. And think about what's really important to you. What do you value? What do you want your life to be like? If you think about one of the experiences that elders have is that there's the shrinking of your future time horizon, right? The older you become, the less time there is in front of you left to live, and the more time there is behind you. And that has an incredible way of focusing your mind on what's really important in your life. If you can cultivate that earlier in your life, then you're laying a beautiful groundwork for your elderhood. But you know, our elderhoods are going to be as different as we are. Karen, your elderhood could be, you know, very active and energetic, and I could see you teaching Pilates and speaking and, you know, traveling, and, you know, mine could look very different. You know, I'm painting a big contrast here, but mine could be very contemplative, very quiet, and possibly looking withdrawn to other people. But they can be very different, I think. And I think the other critical feature, other than starting soon enough, is understanding that it's important to go within yourself and look deep in yourself, but it's important to come back out and share that with your community and with your society. And that's where our intergenerational solidarity is going to come from, when we do that inner work, but we share that inner work back with others around us.
Thank you so much for that valuable presentation and your thoughtful responses to the questions. Excellent. We're ready to move on, and the time has come for us to hear all from Ellen Phipps and her thoughts on social isolation. So the stage goes to Miss Ellen.
Hello there, and welcome everybody as I pull up my slides here. It's an absolute joy and a pleasure to be with you all today, and thank you, Jen. You know, I've been working with Jen a long time. I always learn something new, so thank you for that. So yes, my name is Ellen Phipps. I am 63 years old. I have a background in therapeutic recreation and in gerontology, and like my good colleagues here today, I also graduated from the BCU Department of Gerontology, Master's in Gerontology program, which I embarked on when I was about 57 years old, and I would say was a life-changing experience for me in a very positive way, and I can't say enough about it. So if any of you out there are considering careers in gerontology, I strongly recommend that you do that with the folks at VCU Gerontology Department. I have worked in the field of aging for 40 years, which, gosh, it's kind of gone by in a flash in some ways. I can't believe it's been 40 years. It doesn't seem possible. And for me, my love of working in this field really started at a pretty young age. I have to say that I had extremely positive experiences with older adults in my life when I was a very young child. When I was about 5, my best friend was about 60, and we had a very special relationship, she and I had very close relationships with parents, grandparents, I should say, and I feel like this had a very significant influence on my own aging and on my attitudes towards getting older. I saw these people in my life as mentors, people of wisdom, and people who were nurturing and who wanted to have a lot of fun. And I think that had a lot to do with my career in gerontology. When I was in high school, I had the great fortune of being able to take my guitar and visit local nursing homes and engage in sing-alongs and in music programs. And I learned so much from the residents in the facilities. And that was another very important experience that helped to shape my, my life and my interest in my career. So that's a little bit about me. I'd like to delve into my talk today, which is going to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on long-term care specifically. And we're going to talk a little bit about social isolation and loneliness. And we're going to also look at some really creative solutions that have been introduced around the country. So there's no question that we are experiencing an historical moment with this unprecedented challenge of the COVID-19 global pandemic. We know that older adults are at greater risk of experiencing complications from the virus. And as Jenny was talking about, this is not because of their chronological age, but more has to do with the experience of complications of weaker immune systems, the possibility of a higher likelihood of having a chronic condition such as heart disease, diabetes, lung disease, cancer, or maybe more than one thing, one of those things going on. And that's really what puts people at higher risk, not just the fact of a number of their age. Globally, nursing home residents are affected more than anyone. And it's interesting that that 2.1 million Americans, that represent less than 1% of the US population, reside in nursing homes, and yet 42% of all COVID deaths have taken place in nursing homes and assisted living. So that's a pretty high, those are high numbers and very disproportionate numbers. And it's interesting also to note that 81% of the COVID-19 related deaths occurred amongst people, older adults, 65 and older. So we can see the impact. So studies have shown that the impact of systemic ageism on the health of older adults have linked our deep-rooted attitudes about aging to the lack of support and timely response to the COVID pandemic. And this is just really reiterating everything that Jen was talking about. In fact, the WHO recognizes ageism as the last socially accepted form of prejudice. And it's true, right? It's still out there and no one's even really talking about it. Those cards and those greeting cards in those aisles, no one's challenging those things, as Jen was talking about. But this impacts the kind of care that people receive, and it impacts the health outcomes that they experience. And we know that in the United States, these perceptions are reinforced even in medical training when geriatric care doesn't appear on the list of required training for doctors, which I find, quite frankly, staggering. At the onset of the recent pandemic, these ageist attitudes were really quite blatant. And again, just to reiterate some of those things that we've heard from Jen, this idea of the hashtag boomer remover that came out, other comments, Ukraine's ex-health minister said that people over 65 were already corpses and that the government should focus on those who were still alive. In Texas, the state lieutenant's governor suggested that those over 70 sacrifice themselves for the good of the economy. And these remarks, they do more than just legitimize ageism. They're more than just cruel remarks. They also impact the care and support that older adults receive. And the public health messages that we're hearing here have a way of becoming healthcare realities. And I think that is one of the reasons that these things are so dangerous. So for example, in Italy, they cut off the use of ventilators on people 65 years and older. And again, as Jen pointed out earlier, negative aging stereotypes affect longevity. Attitudes resulted in this slow response to guidelines for long-term care facilities, to support with PPE to facilities, and hence a lot of people died, and some of this might have been avoided. At the same time, we learned that the best protection against the virus was to isolate. So, isolating brought on its own problems, and I'd like to take a moment to talk about that for a moment. I think it's fair to say that most of us are social beings by nature. We enjoy meeting up with family and friends. We enjoy going to movies. We enjoy shopping. We enjoy workouts, engaging in volunteer work, going out for meals, exercising. We enjoy time spent with family. We enjoy traveling. And the same is true for older adults, right? This is true for all of us, regardless of our age or our living situation. Whether you're living in a long-term care facility, a nursing home, an assisted living facility, or in the community. Most of us enjoy social connection. But now, due to the pandemic, we've been advised to isolate in order to stay safe. Now, these recommendations are certainly legitimate in this time of crisis. It's important to understand that these recommendations can also, though, have a significant negative impact on older adults, on their mental and physiological health. So here's a list of some of the restrictions that have impacted not only long-term care, but also community programs as well, and older adults living in the community. All of these restrictions serve to exacerbate the problems of social isolation and loneliness. So while, again, I just want to reiterate, we understand why the restrictions are put in place, and I'm not discounting that, but we also need to recognize the impact of further isolation in terms of real health outcomes on older adults. So some of the things that we've listed here have to do with, people not being able to visit with family members. So people that are living alone might not get to see their loved ones. Trips to the store were curtailed or not happening at all. A lot of people were getting home deliveries instead for their groceries. For the most part, travel has stopped. Transportation options became very limited, except for perhaps critical medical appointments. The congregate meals that we often see in the senior centers were closed down for about 4 months. They're beginning to reopen somewhat in some cases, but that was huge. People that really relied on getting their food and getting their socialization every day, that just stopped cold for several months. Adult day services programs stopped. Group activities, even within inside residential care, long-term care facilities, the group activities came to a halt. And even the idea of eating together in the dining room, which was a great opportunity for networking and socializing with others, came to a halt, and residents were asked to just eat in their own rooms. Limited healthcare providers coming in from the outside, like podiatry or maybe physical therapy, occupational therapy. So these were cut off for a long time. And then older adults really stopped engaging in the volunteer work that they had been involved with before the pandemic. So again, social isolation and loneliness, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. And I'd like to highlight as an example, before the pandemic, loneliness and social isolation had been identified by healthcare professionals as a major health concern, having significant negative impact on the health of older adults. So the additional restrictions have increased this problem. So a quarter of adults age 65 and older are considered to be socially isolated, and 43% of them report feeling lonely. Remember, again, this was before the pandemic. So let's take a look at what we mean by social isolation and loneliness, because they're really two different concepts. Social isolation can lead to loneliness in some people, while others can feel lonely without being socially isolated. So in a way, loneliness can be thought of as the subjective feeling of being alone, whereas social isolation is more the lack of physical social connections, maybe fewer relationships, infrequent contact with others. The pandemic has increased the problem of loneliness in older adults. Isolating older adults from friends and family increases loneliness and potentially worsens health conditions. So isolating older adults from friends and family increases loneliness. And I want to highlight that there is a direct correlation that I'm going to talk about in a minute between loneliness and health. According to the CDC and the NIH, social isolation significantly increased a person's risk of premature death from all causes, a risk that may rival smoking, obesity, and physical inactivity. Social isolation was associated with a 50% increase risk in dementia. So, you know, how does this happen? So there's actually a biology behind what's going on. And we can see this quote from the NIH: the biology of loneliness can accelerate the buildup of plaque in arteries. It can help cancer cells grow and spread and promote inflammation in the brain, leading to Alzheimer's disease. And loneliness promotes several different types of wear and tear on the body. So you can see there's a real physical connection. And it's not just something that makes people feel sad, but really can have a strong negative impact on health outcomes. So higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide, and loneliness amongst heart failure patients was associated with a nearly 4 times increase in the risk of death, 68% increase in risk of hospitalization, and 57% increase of emergency department visits. It sounds like a lot of doom and gloom. I know, I recognize this, but I think it's important for us to remain hopeful and to point out that it's important to recognize these statistics and these implications of loneliness and how they impact health outcomes, because until we start talking about these things, we're not going to be able to address them properly. So it's important to recognize and talk about these issues so that we may begin to problem solve solutions. There are things that we can do. So for one thing, I'm particularly thrilled with the way we have started to reframe the narrative from social distancing, which has been the directive from the beginning, to physical distancing while staying socially connected. We really don't want to be socially distancing. We want to be socially connected, but it's important to stay physically distant. With this in mind, we can begin to look at some solutions. So, for example, who is at greatest risk of social isolation? And when we have the tools to identify who is at the greatest risk, then we're able to address those issues and come up with a personal plan for people who have been identified, just as if we would do for someone who's been identified with high blood pressure or diabetes. They have to be diagnosed first before we can come up with a solution and a plan for them. And there are tools out there that social workers and other health professionals are using in order to identify risk factors of social isolation. And some of the things that you'll see in these assessment tools include risk factors such as living alone or living in a rural community, beginning with a poor functional status with several medical conditions. Widowhood would be a possible risk factor, and being female is as well. Being of lower income and lower education status increases the risk of social isolation. Having experienced losses, maybe the death of a loved one, of a spouse or a friend. Depression can be a risk factor. Just feeling misunderstood by others, like nobody understands me, that kind of feeling can be a risk factor as well. Once we identify who is at risk, there are actions that we can take, not just in long-term care, but also in the community. So let's take a look at what's happening across the country in terms of innovative solutions to some of these issues that I've been talking about. So it's really important to utilize as much of the resources from family and friends and those support networks. Talking to families about what's going to work best for my loved one, and staying in communication with families, particularly for people who are living in long-term care settings. Support to facilities in terms of PPE and guidelines for keeping people safe. And we're going to look at some programs that are addressing that right here in Virginia. And helping people to get involved with volunteer opportunities is really key as well. And there are plenty of people out there that are really willing to help, and there are ways to volunteer and help safely. One of the great programs that is occurring out of the University of Virginia is called the ECHO program. This is Dr. Archibald Penen, and she has headed up a team through UVA that is providing support to long-term care facilities throughout Virginia. They refer to it as the GeriPal, meaning geriatric engagement and resource integration for post-acute and long-term care facilities. And what they've done is they've brought together hospitals and community-based resources to assist the local facilities in preventing and responding to the COVID outbreaks. They have seen reduced mortality from COVID. They've already got some outcomes from this program. And I've provided a link here to find out more about this program. Dr. Archibald Penen has presented at some of our meetings in Region 9 through Aging Together, and it's really a phenomenal program, providing not just the PPE and the medical support, but emotional support to staff and residents as well. So it's a very comprehensive team approach. And I suggest you look into that to find out more information about what they're doing. Other approaches include the importance of helping residents to get outside, to look at creative visitation through window visits, and we'll take a look at some others in a minute. Telephone calling has worked well, both in the community and also in long-term care. In fact, Dr. Archibald Penen in her ECHO program had many of the medical students calling people in facilities and talking to them at length. And for families to call way more often than maybe they thought they should. So keep that calling going. Pen pal programs are certainly coming back, with students writing letters or others writing letters, volunteers writing letters to reach out to people in long-term care. I'll tell you, recently, at the beginning of the pandemic, a friend of mine wrote an old-fashioned letter to me, and she sent me an article that she thought I would be interested in. And I just cannot tell you the feeling that I had receiving this letter. It was just so moving. It felt so personal. I felt so connected to her. I felt like she really cared. And it was such a positive experience. So I don't think we want to underestimate the power of real snail mail letters like the old days. Students are also writing letters. There's something called simulated presence therapy, which is another way by which families can keep in touch with residents. This involves the family member making a recording where they actually ask a question specific to their loved one, such as, "Oh, I remember when you lived in Concord, New Hampshire. Do you remember what you did with the Girl Scouts? You did such cool programs with the Girl Scouts. Maybe you could tell me about that." And then you leave space of silence and give them the opportunity to respond. So this simulated presence therapy can be used when maybe there haven't been that many phone calls or in between phone calls. Can also be a great way for staff to hear more about people and about their individual experiences from before, getting to know them a little bit better. Other strategies include iPads for connecting to families, not just connecting to families with Zoom or FaceTime, but the iPads can also be used to connect people to games or online museum tours or even virtual vacations that people can do together. This is just really great. In our region, we were able to raise some funds to be able to provide the long-term care facilities with some iPads for their activities departments. So that is something that's pretty easily done. It's not a huge amount of money, and it's a great way to support some of the facilities or for people living in the community as well. Pet therapy can be very effective, and if it's not possible to get a real pet, there are certainly some fake ones out there that look very real. And we're going to take a look at some of those in a minute. Name tags for residents and staff. So if you ask residents what they prefer to be called and they wear a name tag with that name, it just can help to bring staff and residents together and find an excuse to talk to each other. So for example, oh, I see your name is Kathy. Well, I have a daughter named Kathy, and you can sort of help jump off a conversation in that way. Faith services on television, meditation, exercise, yoga, all of these are great ways to improve and maintain mental health during these trying times, not only for residents, but also for ourselves and for people living in the community. We're going to take a look now at some photos that are taken from various places to highlight some creative solutions. I think sometimes a picture speaks 1,000 words. But here's a woman that says, you know, we were used to sitting together, and now we have to sit at least 6 feet apart to have our meals. It's not as fun. It's pretty hard to have a conversation. But this is at least one way where they are bringing people together in this particular facility, and might be, you know, better than everybody staying in their rooms. So an opportunity to come out of your room and socialize in a safe way. In Fauquier County, which is part of the region where I work, our senior center had a senior parade, and it was a mobile parade. And as you can see here, they had a blast. It was very well attended. And it was a great way, when they couldn't be meeting at the senior center, to just come together and have some fun in spite of the pandemic. They got a chance to see each other. Here is one resident that was utilizing our iPads for Seniors program. She's connecting with her daughter, and you can just see by the look on her face the joy that she's getting from this ability to connect, when she would have previously had an in-face visit, a one-on-one in-person visit. Some creative bingo. Several facilities are engaging in hallway bingo, which I thought was pretty creative as well. And at this facility, residents are able to engage and enjoy music while remaining physically distanced but socially connected. So I think music is so powerful, and as much as we can integrate that into the programming for as many people as possible in a safe way is certainly a great strategy. Another facility engaged in Pictionary and some online games, and they had some great success with that. And we talked about pen pal programs, and this was just a wonderful idea of several residents looking for pen pals. You know, I'm looking for a New York Yankees pen pal. So maybe that would just hit a chord with somebody, and you could start a lifelong relationship in that way. And what a wonderful way to be connected to somebody new on a topic that you both can be enthusiastic about. Getting outside is so important. Obviously, it's been very hot, but early mornings, late afternoons, fresh air can't be emphasized enough. And it's important to be done safely. And I think this is a great example of being able to engage in a group activity outdoors and stay connected with people. Now this is pretty cool. This is an Ohio facility, and the Boy Scouts in this area built this plexiglass booth. And this was a really creative solution for families to visit with their loved ones safely. We talked about pets a little while ago. This is a real live pet, and somebody's getting a lot of pleasure out of this, and that's not always possible. But if you can't have a real one, there's some great fake looking pets. This one is actually fake, but people can really have a lot of fun with these simulated pets, and some of them are more realistic looking than others. In this particular facility, we can see physically distanced craft project. So again, people don't necessarily need to be staying in their rooms all day. There are creative ways of coming out and engaging with others. This one woman said she's recently been listening to a lot of gospel music. With the virus out, she's gotten closer to God. And so this is one way that she has coped in being able to listen to music and feeling closer to God, was one way that she's been coping in her facility. I think this might just be my personal favorite in terms of creative ways of staying engaged. This is a tic-tac-toe game on a window at a facility, and they're just having a blast. And again, what a great way to connect, to not be alone, and to have fun. So my final slide here has to do with the importance of taking care of ourselves, which is sometimes hard for us to hear. But if those of us in the healthcare profession, we've heard it over and over again, how important it is to take care of ourselves so that we can better care for others. And I thought there were some really good tips here from the CDC and from AARP for staying mentally healthy and physically healthy during this pandemic. I'm sure you've all heard of a lot of these, but it's important to really take a look and try to figure out what you can realistically incorporate into your lives. The first one is pretty key, and I can tell you it's worked for me personally. Taking breaks from watching and reading or listening to news stories, including being on social media. You know, you can be bombarded with so much information. I absolutely feel my anxiety and my blood pressure rising when I'm listening to a lot of stories or when I'm spending too much time on social media. So taking a break from that, even telling your friends, I'm going to be off social media for a few days. I just need to take a break. That can really help to kind of scale down the stress a few notches. Taking care of your body and your health with either mindfulness training, yoga, deep breaths, meditating, stretching, these are all really helpful. There's some great apps to help do that are free. Eating healthy at this time is really important. I've heard a lot of people talk about the challenges of, you know, trying to stay healthy eating while they're at home all day working and maybe not exercising as much and maybe eating lots of food that they shouldn't be eating. It's really easy to do when you're at home all day, but it's important to kind of keep an eye on that. Regular exercise, really revving up your activity routine. There's some great YouTube workouts that are 30-minute workouts that are available online. If you want to email me, I can provide some recommendations for that. Getting plenty of sleep, 7-8 hours of sleep is important. And of course, it's very tempting to go down that road with alcohol, drug, and substance abuse during these difficult times. But the more you're engaging in healthy activities, I think the less you'll be wanting to engage in going down that road. But there are plenty of places to reach out to and support for substance abuse, alcohol abuse, and mental health support. And again, I can provide people with links to the Mental Health Association as well. Taking time to unwind, trying some different activities, changing the routine up a little bit to make it interesting, connecting with others, really reaching out and talking to friends, calling people, talk about how you're feeling. Other people are probably feeling the same way. Connecting with community or faith-based organizations, again, either through social media or by phone. A lot of services are being done via Zoom, and that's a great platform to get that spiritual side that you might be looking for. There are great volunteer opportunities online, and it's important for people to get engaged in volunteer work. AARP is always looking for volunteers. They train them. They can help to make phone calls to people who are isolated and living alone. And then making plans, having something to look forward to. They may or may not pan out. I'm hoping for a trip to the beach in September. I'm looking forward to it, but I'm not holding my breath. But it's kind of nice to just have it out there, just in case I might be able to get there. It's really something to focus on that will be very enjoyable. So just to recap what we talked about today briefly, some of the highlights, that societal ageism has impacted our response to the pandemic. And Ginny really talked long and hard about that. And I just want to reiterate how true that is and how much so that has been. Distancing can lead to loneliness, and loneliness and social isolation can really impact physical health outcomes. In many cases, sometimes as much as smoking or not taking care of your diabetes. Healthcare professionals can use tools to assess who is at greatest risk of loneliness. Once we identify who is at greatest risk, we can begin to make a plan for addressing that so that we can avoid some of these negative healthcare outcomes and turn that around for people. There are things we can do. There's reason to feel hopeful. And it's really important, as hard as it may be to do sometimes, to take care of ourselves so that we can be better caregivers. And with that, I thank you so much for joining us today. I was so excited to see so many of you from across the country. And at this point, I will be happy to take questions. And I think I'm supposed to stop my slide share now.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Such important information. There's been quite a few questions that have come in. And the first one I want to mention is, can you please review the statistics about social isolation as it relates to age? That was one of the questions that has come in.
Oh, back on that first slide?
Yeah.
Was it?
Speak to it. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, can you repeat the question one more time? I want to make sure I get to the right place.
Can you please clarify the statistics on social isolation for people 65 and older?
Got you. Okay, yeah. Sorry, missed that. Okay, so So 81%, what we talked about was 81% of COVID-related deaths occurred amongst older adults 65 and older, okay? And 42% took place in nursing homes. But then we talked about, we also talked about social isolation, and a quarter of adults aged 65 and older were considered to be socially isolated, and that was before the pandemic. And 43% of those reported feeling lonely.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. That's great. We had another question about residents that are in hospice care and their experience in social isolation. Can you address that?
You know, I think that's going to be a great question for Enid. She's going to be talking about end of life and hospice care, and I think she might bring a different perspective. I think there will be some unique challenges there that she will address.
Okay, we'll wait for that. Another question that came about was when there is an individual that's basically living in denial, where they feel that they don't have to wear a mask and they're not at risk, and they live in a long-term care facility or a facility where it's communal living, how do you best recommend that they cope with that scenario?
That's a really great question, and I think a real challenge in that situation. I think that comes up not only with you know, people who might be in denial, but also for people who have dementia who may not understand why they have to keep a mask on. So I think in those situations, it's really reliant on staff to either come up with very creative ways of encouraging that mask wearing or in ensuring the physical distance.
Okay. Another question is, are there specific groups that experience a higher risk of loneliness?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there are. We've seen higher incidences of loneliness in immigrants, in African-American population, in minority groups, Latino groups. So there's absolutely some different groups, LGBTQ groups as well. So there are definitely some specific groups that are at higher risk for social isolation and loneliness.
Okay. Another one, which I think is probably a very important question that we all need to know, what can you do if you're experiencing loneliness?
So I think that's a great question, and there's so many resources out there. A lot of the area agencies on aging, mental health associations have hotlines. There are a lot of COVID hotlines available. Senior Navigator, elder care locators. I could probably put together a list to send to you for resources for people to address that question, because there really are some phenomenal resources out there for people.
Okay, and to that point, at the end of our webinar today, we're going to share email addresses so participants can reach out to you and Jenny and Enid as well. The last question we have is, what if someone wants to live alone and their family or close friends don't agree with their decision?
That's a great question, because I think oftentimes we as family members or as healthcare professionals feel that we know what's best for somebody else. And what we always need to remember, that a person has the right to make a decision, and a person has the right to live alone and might be quite content living alone, even though other people don't agree with that decision. So it's really important to sort of assess the situation. Now, obviously, if the person is at risk, of, serious health conditions or a risk of falling, there may need some support to be put in place, and maybe people can work together. But we see this all the time where adult children are coming to healthcare professionals and saying, we've got to move mom out of X and move her into Y, and she doesn't want to go. And we hear that all the time. And I think it's really important to recognize that as long as somebody is compos mentos and they have the ability to make independent decisions, we need to respect those decisions, and we can gently try to introduce different supports for them.
Okay. There is one final question. I think we have time for that. And that's the Pen Pal program. Someone wants to know if that was started at VCU or where the origination of that program was.
So I'm aware of several different Pen Pal programs, and in the region, I work in Planning District 9 in Virginia, and somebody in the Fauquier County has started that program. And our agency, Aging Together, is also looking to make some connections there. So I would say, feel free to email me for sure, and I can try to connect you with some different Pen Pal programs that are available.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for such a dynamic and fascinating presentation. We are ready to invite Enid Butler, and we're excited to have her talk to us about a very important and intriguing topic. So here we go. Welcome, Enid.
Hi there. Let me get my presentation up. Hang on one second. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for coming. I'm Enid Butler. I am a gerontologist. I also got my master's degree from VCU Gerontology, and I highly recommend it. I'm with Ellen and Jenny about what a value it's been to me, both really professionally as well as personally. And I'm also a certified thanatologist. And what that means is the study of death, dying, and bereavement. What that also means is that I can shut down a dinner party in about 15 minutes when I start talking about what I do. All kidding aside, I really am passionate about end of life. I really feel honored to walk alongside individuals and their families who are facing life-limiting illness. And I think the transition between what is here and what is next is very sacred. And it's such an honor and a privilege to be able to work in that space. Everyone's talked about how old they are, so I'm going to share that I had a banner birthday this year. I turned 60, and I have started, I think part of working in end of life has helped me start my elderhood. I'm going to read a quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Many of you know her for her stages of dying or her stages of grief, and she's really a pioneer of end of life care. And what she writes is, it's only when we truly know and understand that we have a limited time on earth and that we have no way of knowing when our time is up will we begin to live each day to the fullest as if it was the only one that we had. So I love that quote. I like layering that with what Jenny had to say earlier about being in that field. So I find that as Jenny says, the window shrinks of time that we have ahead of us. People often ask, how can you work in death and dying and deal with it every single day? And I said, it's a sacredness, and it also really keeps reminding me how precious life is. So aging is a privilege, and aging is a privilege that not all of us get. So anyway, you've all been sitting there for a couple of hours, maybe you've been standing, but I'd love everybody to stand up and just wiggle a little bit. And if you haven't yet, if you aren't already moving, just get up and move a little bit. And then we're going to take a couple of deep breaths. Let's just take a couple of breaths. One breath in and out, and another breath in and out. So we're going to be talking about some tough stuff, and I wanted us to just have a quiet moment of getting centered. Every time I talk about or teach on end of life, I always feel like I'm trying to get 10 pounds of sand into a 5-pound bag. The end of life is so vast and large and complex and deep and wide. We're going to try to cover a lot today in our time together. One thing that's interesting, and it's very different than most of the presentations I've done, a lot of the information we're going to talk about today is only 4 or 5 months old. So as part of my preparation for this talk today, I interviewed funeral directors. I talked to the hospice staff here at Sentara Hospice where I work. I talked to death doulas and people that worked in long-term care, and I wanted to get their perspective. And there's a couple of resources at the end that I'll share with you that I think you'll find valuable as you start trying to really keep moving through this new dynamic that we have with COVID. So let's set the stage. Most of you know these things, but I want to reiterate some of them. You know, we know that this has had a worldwide impact, that we saw it coming from across the sea, that it's highly contagious, and the contagious nature of it is what makes it so frightening, particularly with the result of many people dying from that. The numbers are shifting every day. It's hard to really kind of keep track very specifically of what the numbers are. We're getting mixed messages about, you know, how it spreads, how it doesn't spread. There is a very short death trajectory. For those who end up dying of COVID, the death trajectory is a very short period, and that is very frightening, and that has also created some real dynamics in the end-of-life field. Nursing homes and hospital protocols are very focused on reducing spread and limiting spread. So there has been a lot, as Ellen just talked about, in terms of nursing homes, in terms of not letting people out of their rooms, not letting outside visitors in. Hospitals are doing the same thing. Many times people are not allowed to come in, the loved ones with someone who is hospitalized. So that's a very frightening dynamic. And it also creates a big impact at end of life, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. There's been a shortage of PPE, but when there is PPE, you know, clinicians are wearing lots of gear and garb, and it's kind of frightening as they navigate working with these patients. We have social distancing, or maybe we should call it physical distancing, and masks. And all those things have changed the dynamic of how all of us operate, but has really helped change the impacted how end of life and how we end up serving people who are facing life-limiting illness. So Ellen went through these numbers, but COVID-19 overwhelmingly impacts older adults. And when you think about COVID and what all the fuss is about, if you will, not to minimize it, you know, it is all about the death factor. And 81% of all the deaths are in individuals over the age of 65. 42% of those are living in nursing homes. So it does have a great impact. Excuse me just a minute. There we go. Okay.
Enid, can you please share your slides with us, please? We're not seeing your slides.
We're not seeing my slides. Okay, hang on. Okay, let me get to. There we go. Is that better?
We're good to go.
Can you see them now, Karen?
Yes, ma'am.
I apologize. I thought I had all the tech parts straightened out. So you got to see me full screen, and now you don't have to deal with that anymore. So here we go. Okay, let's talk about the dying experience and what happens in the dying experience. Death is actually a shared experience. We think about death really in terms of the individual with a life-limiting illness, and certainly they experience death much more profoundly. Obviously, it is all about the person with the life-limiting illness. They are in the center of the circle of care. But death is also shared by their family and their loved ones, and it impacts their family and their loved ones. And oftentimes family are people that are identified. We found in hospice care that sometimes the people that are in that circle are really more chosen rather than blood relatives. And the other stakeholder, there's really three stakeholders in this experience. And the third stakeholder is healthcare providers. Now, healthcare providers is a very broad spectrum of not only nurses, doctors, aides, but we're also talking about chaplains, we're talking about social workers. If you look at the numbers, individuals over the age of 65, older adults, the majority of them are taken care of at end of life. They're either enrolled in hospice care, they are in a hospital, or they are in some kind of long-term care setting. So their healthcare providers are very, very involved at end of life in these three different settings. And they do have a stake in this experience, not only professionally, but in terms of their personal commitment. So we're going to talk about, just really quickly, reflectively, about what a notion of a good death is. And I use the word notion because really death is very individual. It is based on cultural norms, on what personal preferences and values are. But there are some themes that really arise in the research. So I broke them down. These are the top 8 themes that have become that have arisen in most commonly in research. If you look, the top category really includes preferences for the dying process, treatment preferences, and symptom control. And those things are all involving, I'm so sorry, treatment plan reflects the values, there's autonomy, the individual is involved in decision-making and treatment decisions, affairs are in order, and that there's no suffering, that pain and symptoms are controlled. The second category falls under spirituality and religiosity. And those things are really exploring religious beliefs. Spirituality, we all have something inside of us that is spiritual. And there's a lot of exploration at that point. There's a lot of discussion, there's life reflection, looking back, and finding, looking at their lives. They want to make meaning of the death, emotional and psychological support from those around them, and dignity and independence is really important. And the third category is about family and, again, life completion. And part of that life completion is the saying goodbye, looking over their life, trying to make amends for things that maybe they wish they hadn't done, thanking people for things they've done for them. It's important to a dying individual that their family is prepared for the death. And also, one thing that is very important in the grief process as it relates to the family is that the memorializing is appropriate to their cultural and spiritual beliefs. So COVID impacts not only the dying experience of the COVID-19 patient, but also the non-COVID individual and their loved ones. It's not just about people who have COVID and are terminal in that setting, but also anyone who happens to be at end of life and facing terminal illness. So if you look at what's happening out there, we talked about what a good death is, and that's really what everyone in the healthcare field wants to deliver. It's what each of us want individually. But with the COVID environment, infection control is really taking priority. Protection against spread is very much outweighing comforting the dying and providing a good death. It's not how people want it to be, but that's what's happening right now. So what that looks like when we start looking at our good death paradigm is, in the top category, people's affairs may not be in order, that things are happening so quickly. If they have been diagnosed with COVID, they might not be in order, or decisions are being made under duress. The individual may lack the ability to express what their needs are, and the power of attorney may be directing care remotely. So all those things about treatment preferences and symptom control and being ready and having all your affairs in order, those things are being impacted. Now, when you look at what the protocols are in hospitals and nursing homes, that there's either no or limited visits by family. That's also happening under, when we start looking even at the infection control, that's also happening in our hospice families. A lot of our families are refusing visits. They only want our clinical staff in there. They only want the nurse and the aide. They don't want the rest of the psychosocial team. And so there's lack of staff to spend time on psychosocial needs because they're either not available, they're not allowed in, and that is really impacting some of the psychosocial process. If you look at the last category of family and life completion, there's a lack of time to prepare and process. Things are happening very quickly. You know, you hear stories of they went to the hospital, we couldn't go with them, and then they were gone. Loved ones are often not allowed at bedside at end of life. We are finding that it's really not consistent. Some facilities are letting us in, others are not, or letting family members in. Usually in the final hours that they are trying to make exceptions, but they are limiting how many people are being able to be in the room. And goodbyes are often made virtually outside of a window. And we've had stories in our hospice of nurses, our nurses being in with a patient as they are dying and the family standing outside of the window. That is not only heart-wrenching for the family, but it is really, really challenging for the staff as well. And social distancing is impacting how we memorialize, how we have funerals, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we talked a little bit about the impact on hospice. Referrals are down from all sources. It's unfortunate because hospice care, I'm partial to it. I work for a hospice agency, but it's unfortunate that we are not seeing as many people coming on hospice, either for COVID or for other illnesses. We talked about refusing visits, and what's happening with, we talked about the PPE. When our staff is going into a home, they're wearing face shields, they're wearing masks, they're going to have a gown on, and that really interferes with kind of that therapeutic relationship. One of the things that hospice provides, that we all provide at bedside, no matter which setting that we're delivering end-of-life care, is that therapeutic, that comforting presence. And the PPE can really impact that. We're seeing a high use of technology-based visits, which we'll talk about more, phone, video chat, that kind of thing. And volunteer visits are suspended indefinitely. So I run a volunteer program, and that is near and dear to my heart because our volunteers really provide a lot of value to our families. Quickly, advanced care planning. You know, any of these topics we could talk about in depth, but we're going to just touch quickly on them. Advanced care planning. COVID really creates the need greater than ever. And if any of you do not have an advanced care plan, I don't care how old you are, please, please get one. Whether it's a COVID environment or whatever, we all need to have an advanced care plan. One of the ways that providers are developing COVID-specific materials, and they're positioning them as a way to help reduce virus uncertainty. It's particularly important with people that are dealing with chronic life-limiting diseases. And it's one of the things that's really important, particularly in this environment where we're talking about ventilators and really invasive treatment. It's really important that we understand people's goals and values, because it may be that we have someone who's dealing with a disease and they're like, don't worry about the ventilator, I'm okay. I don't want heroic measures made. So that is really important in that conversation. It's hard to have it at bedside. So what we're seeing is a ton of loss and grief. Many of you, I know myself, I keep feeling myself feeling completely out of sorts and kind of off. And when you start thinking about it, what we've had is a shattering of our assumptive world. What the assumptive world is, it's what we believe to be true. It's what makes us feel safe. It's the things that ground us in reality and give our lives purpose and meaning. And so COVID has taken a lot of that away. It's taken away our sense of safety. It's changing how we die and what we die from. It's changing how we memorialize and we mourn those that we've lost. It also is really uncovering a lot about the societal values, societal value of the lives of others. Jenny did a great job talking about ageism. And so it's very frightening, it's very disconcerting if we are someone, if we're saying, hey, wait a minute, are we all of a sudden making this particular group of people dispendable for the common good? And that ageism is very, it's very disconcerting and very disorienting. And also the whole social or physical distancing and the masks causes all kinds of isolation. So what we're seeing is, I call it a grief trifecta. We're seeing traumatic type loss. Trauma is a danger or threat that is either real or perceived. And we're seeing all kinds of danger all around us, all kinds of traumatic things around us. And so that kind of trauma type loss, some of those might be death losses, some of those might be non-death losses. We're seeing a lot of complicated grief, and complicated grief really is defined by the inability to, you know, process the feelings, move forward. Complicated grief is when there's still a lot of disbelief about a loss. There's feelings of being overwhelmed. And this is not right immediately after the loss. These are as time progresses. And so we're also seeing disenfranchised grief. Now, disenfranchised grief is basically the type of grief that is not validated. And what I mean by that, and where you'd see this in COVID, is right now everybody's so focused on who's dying from COVID. If we lose a loved one to something other than COVID, oftentimes people will say, oh, well, that wasn't a traumatic loss. That was, you know, your grandmother died at 84. Oh, okay, that wasn't a COVID loss. We saw a lot of this at 9/11. After 9/11, if someone didn't die in the 9/11, then it really was a loss that kind of didn't count. And so that really impacts the grief and the grief process. And Robert Niemeyer, many of you might know him. He is a very well-known and very well-respected grief theorist, and he's done a lot of presentations on Hospice Foundation of America on their, they've been doing a ton of great webinars. And he talked about this being a tsunami of grief that we are experiencing. So I want to take a minute for us to step back, because we've looked at all of this and we're like, we're not designed, we're not made to live in this kind of hyper traumatic arousal. Teresa Rando, I think she called it the chronic hyper traumatic arousal. And I loved it when she gave a name to it. So when I see myself reacting, when I see those around me reacting, and I'm sure all of us out there, all of you could relate to that. She called it, I love what she called it, the traumatic hyper chronic arousal, or some version of that. So I think what I want to just have us pause here for a moment. Let's try to be kind and let's try to be gentle, and let's start with ourselves. You know, Jenny talked about slowing down. We talked about like taking a breath. We're going to talk a little bit more later about self-care. But when we start identifying what it is that we're dealing with and why we are so worked up and why we feel so just, I don't know, low-grade anxious. I found myself, I said, this kind of like this buzz in the back of my head. You know, it's a lot of it is grief. A lot of it is that the world, the things that were under our feet that felt stable and solid have been rocked. And so let's recognize it for what it is. And a lot of that, if you think about it, because what COVID, all the fear about COVID is the death factor. Now, I did do some research to see if I could find anything that people were saying about death anxiety. And there really wasn't enough, even anecdotally, that I felt comfortable sharing today. And I talked to some of my go-to people when I couldn't find anything in my digging. But you know, I think we do. That is kind of, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the research going forward in terms of death anxiety and how that has changed our perception of anxiety towards our own deaths. So we're going to talk about meeting our needs, meeting the needs. And again, a lot of this information is very, very new. I kept, as I was going through it, I was like, gosh, I wish I had a silver bullet. I wish I had, you know, the holy grail that I could say, this is the thing that we need to be doing. But really what's happening out there is people are adapting, and they are constantly adapting to what is going on and what the needs are and what we have available to go back and to deliver, as the research calls it, the good death. How can we deliver the good death? How can we deliver those elements? So we're going to talk about what is out there. And one of the sources I've used, and we'll look at it at the end, it was a paper, a white paper that was written by a group of 70 social workers, doctors, thanatologists, grief, you know, bereavement chaplains. They got together and they put together this document of what was happening in COVID and what they were seeing. And these folks were from all over the country and what they were seeing. So a lot of what you're going to see here are things that I got, everything you're going to see, I've got from either my interviews or the paper or things that we've done here at our organization. So connecting at end of life, when we talk about those things that, you know, in the good death that really involve connecting at end of life, connection is challenging, but it's not impossible. And connecting is really important. We are wired for connection. All of us are wired for connection. And at end of life, it becomes more important than ever. So one of the things we want to focus on are the reminders of love and support. How can we love and support our individuals? How can we tangibly have reminders of love and support when that individual may or may not be accessible to us? And part of that is how it goes from patient to family and family to patient, because the patient, assuming that they are still cognizant and alert, they want to communicate to their loved ones as well as the family, as well as be supported by their family. So one way to do it is really through letters and cards and artwork, that those things can go back and forth. For instance, and if a patient or someone facing life-limiting illness, or if they want to get something to their family and they are not able to write it, sometimes the staff, wherever they are, can help them do that. Or they can translate it to someone over the phone who can do it. Video messages, photo messages, audio messages can go. If you look at the picture in the corner, and don't look too closely because that's my daughter and I, we were at the beach, and we have a family member who is on hospice care. And she does not want guests. She does not want visitors. And so that's one of many pictures we took on the beach trip to send to her so she would know that we were thinking about her. We did a great big we love you sign. We got other members of the family and different pictures, and we sent those to her. So we've been able to keep communication with her, even though she really doesn't want anyone in her home right now, and her family doesn't really want visitors because of COVID and other reasons. Real-time video or audio. I think many of you have seen, you know, FaceTiming loved ones, FaceTiming people in the hospital. A lot of the staff in the hospitals, any chance they get, they're trying to have real-time video or audio speaker and have it go back and forth. It's very heart-wrenching, you know, in some of those. We had several cases where the family members were saying their goodbyes and they were doing it on FaceTime, and our staff were holding the device. And it's not what anyone wants, but it is better than that individual passing away with everything, you know, without speaking at all or seeing their loved ones and saying those goodbyes. Zoom type sharing with family and friends. And this was really interesting. And a death doula that I interviewed was telling me about some things she's done with her clients. And one of them was she did a Zoom meeting, and she invited this individual's, her clients, friends and family from all over the country, and did a Zoom meeting with her client. And they were sharing, all of the family and friends were sharing things they loved about the client. They were giving the client encouraging messages. And she was doing the same to the best of her ability as to where she was in her illness process. And that, she said that was very, very powerful. It kind of goes along with, there's kind of this new trend of people having funerals before people die. I don't know that they exactly call it that, but they have kind of parties to say, we want to say all these things before you go. And so this was done. This individual was not super close to death, but she was terminal, and she did have a terminal illness. And so that Zoom call really was very important and went very, very well. And the other is, you saw the tic-tac-toe game, and it's very encouraging when you see tic-tac-toe. It's very discouraging when you realize that end-of-life goodbyes are being said outside of the windows of long-term care facilities. Having said that, when you consider what the alternative is, if all the family can't get inside, then that they do get to say goodbye, and they do get to see each other face to face. Funerals, as we all know, have taken a pretty big hit in terms of the funeral industry has been under a lot of pressure. Not only do they have to worry about, infection, and in some areas of the country, the volume of the deaths that are happening. They have to figure out how they can help their clients memorialize, the families of the bereaved, how they can help them memorialize. And the good news, what all the funeral homes reassured me, and I find that also in my research, is that they are used to protocols, infection control. They have those protocols in place. They are already set up for that with PPE. So that was not something new to them, which actually made the rest of it a little bit, that was one thing that was off of their plate. But when you look at what the importance of a funeral are, what they really provide, every culture and civilization attends to the proper care of their dead. And proper care really is defined, as we talked about earlier, by cultural norms and values of that particular group or individual. And the disruption of those processes can disrupt the grief process. So when you start looking at what some of those things are that are really important, one is the reality of the loss. And so a funeral or whatever service, however you want to define it, it's the demarcation between what was and what is to become, and it really marks the loss. Community support, you see who is going to be walking alongside you as you move into, if you're the bereaved, as you move into the next stage. And it also helps define what your belief systems are. You can express your belief systems, and there's meaning in that. There's meaning making and those rituals that go through that are part of a funeral. And most importantly, and the main focus is the celebration of the life of the individual that was lost. So with social distancing and the inability to gather, I don't know about you guys, but I've often, maybe because I work in this field, I often think about what my funeral would look like and how many people would come, and and how many people have come to the funerals of the people that I love. And then I start thinking about now, and I thought, wow, that's so different than normal. And it's very disorienting to people. So what I love this, I use this headline because basically one of the funeral directors said to me that they want to replicate as close to possible what the normal tradition would be, to the best of their ability. And part of that challenge has been that the regulations for funeral homes keep changing. If they have a chapel, are they considered a church? Are they considered a business? What kind of rules are they under? And they're trying to stay on top of all those regulations and guidelines. But if you look in here, and these are some pictures, these are also some things that I talked to the funeral homes about. Over to the left, you see, right here, you see this group of socially distanced funeral. It looks, except for the fact that the chairs are far apart, and it looks like some of the people are wearing their masks. We won't go there. They are socially distanced at the funeral. The little camera is live stream, and I don't know about you guys, but if I have been to several live streamed, I've seen several live streamed funerals. They said, and all the funeral homes said they thought that they would continue that process. And that way people from all over the country can participate. They're seeing a lot of graveside services where it used to be that the church or wherever the main service was, what building that was held in was the main service. And now, and graveside was kind of a smaller, not as much emphasis on that, but a lot of funerals are happening right now, graveside. I went to one myself where we were, the family was under the tent and everyone was very, very socially distanced, and they had a PA system. And we all stood out in the cemetery and we heard it by the PA system. But at least in that environment, the individual could look around and they could see their people and their community. The other two down below are really kind of interesting. One, they're both kind of drive-through funerals, which may sound a little bit odd. But if you look at the one in the center, casket is there. It is open for those people that believe in open caskets and viewing. I come from the South, and I'm from North Carolina, and that is very common where I grew up. So the cars just drive through, and the person, the deceased, is in the coffin, and the bereaved, the family members, are greeting people through the windows of the car. There's something I really like about that, because they do get to talk to people individually. I'm sure it's exhausting as people are going through, but it kind of combines things. And the other one is, it's like a drive-through window, like you're going through the bank. There's a window and that casket is right there. So I don't know anybody locally who does the one with just the window, but I'm sure there are people in different communities that can provide that. So hang on. Okay, so we talked about that. Here's a couple of other ways that we can memorialize is a candlelight vigil at the home of the deceased. And maybe it's the family sitting on the porch and everyone out in the lawn, and they're all burning candles, and maybe there's songs, or there's some kind of ceremony just that is at the home of the deceased. What they're suggesting is that we encourage creativity. Okay, things are different. And I think we've all looked around at the way people are adapting to all kinds of different things and all the different creative ways that we are adapting and to what's going on out there, and how we can do kind of workarounds. I don't want to necessarily compare funerals to high school graduations, but if you look at those and you see all the different ways that people have celebrated high school graduations, they've really infused a lot of creativity into that. And so some of the ideas for the creative ideas were to have an altar at home with things that memorialize the person. Maybe a friend of mine, when she lost her husband, she and I put together like pictures of him and things that were important to them. And we made this area kind of like an altar in her home, so she would feel that presence there. Virtual storytelling, get on Zoom, like we talked about the group that met with the client before she passed away, but maybe you get your family and friends together and you tell stories. We are all about our story, and our story is really important. And so we can tell the stories of our loved ones and what they meant to us. And that also bonds people together. It supports the family that who have lost the loved one and all of those that love them, and they celebrate those things that brought them together. A cooking event of special recipes, and I thought this one was really, especially for families that have traditional, they're all about the food or all about the recipes. And I know when my mother-in-law passed away, my daughter and I made her favorite cheesecake, because she made a wonderful cheesecake. You couldn't give anybody the recipe, although she had given it to us. And so in honor of her passing, we made her special cheesecake. A lot of people are also scheduling traditional events later. They're not doing them now. And it's going to be interesting to see if they actually do it, or if they decide that they're not going to do it later. But that's what a lot of the funeral homes are suggesting. Notes or special photo items for cremation or burial. So those things can go in the caskets, or they can go in the container for cremation. So bereavement, there is really an increased demand for and pressure on chaplains and bereavement professionals right now. And what they're finding is that there's a lot of support needed for the death as well as the COVID-related anxiety and isolation. Our bereavement coordinator here was telling me that she is finding that a lot of the phone contacts she's making, that people are staying on longer and longer because they are so anxious about COVID that they're feeling even more isolated than ever. And our chaplains are spending a lot of time talking to families. So we need to, there really is going to need to be a plan for future grief needs. And if there's people out there in the field of bereavement and grief, I think that we can take a playbook from what happened after 9/11, but I think that we are going to need to be prepared for the griefs that really kind of dealing with all that grief. There's going to be a lot of prolonged grieving going on. So what a lot of bereavement support looks like right now, there's a lot of virtual support groups. A lot of people are doing Zoom or WebEx, they're going online. And at first glance, you would think that that would be like, who wants to go to a grief support group on a computer? But what they're finding is a lot of people, anecdotally, I'm hearing that the bereaved are not, the participants aren't having so much of a problem with it. They're like, particularly if it was a group that existed before because they already know the people. But they're saying, I don't have to leave my home. I can stay in my home and I can have this group. There's we in hospice, we make regular calls and check-ins on our bereaved. That's part of our bereavement program that lasts for 13 months after the individual's death. There are regular calls and check-ins. Any of us who have loved ones or people we're dealing with who are grieving, keep checking on them. Notes, handwritten, texts. My friend whose husband's funeral I went to, she said, even if somebody just drops me a line, if I'm sitting there at night, I know that someone's thinking about me. Real-time virtual visits. I have done some of these with my friends. It's like, okay, let's drink tea together and chat on face-to-face. And that's really helpful also with bereavement. You can find someone that you love and that really is not comfortable with in person, that you can get online with them and you can have a meal or you can watch a favorite TV show. Netflix even has the ability to share viewing. I'm not quite sure how to do it, but ask a teenager. I learned it from my teenage daughter. Exercise and movement virtually or in person. And what you might want to do is set reminders on your phone. If you're dealing with someone who has lost a loved one, put reminders on your phone for either the intervals that you want to check in on them or special dates. If you know a birthday's coming up, if you know an anniversary is coming up, you might, those are really good times to check in. So we talked about the stakeholder groups, and healthcare professionals are a really important stakeholder group in this. If you look at the impact on providers, and when I'm talking about providers, I'm talking about not just people that work in the hospital. We're talking about people who work in nursing homes and long-term care, who work in hospice care, who might be working for an adult day, whatever your role is. I know people are worried about themselves and their families. They're worried about, there's this tension about commitment, their professional roles versus their personal roles. There's a constant concern about spread. The protocols of PPE are always changing. Not having a hard time delivering a good death. They are, as we've talked about, healthcare providers are often conduits for heart-wrenching farewell messages. There's a lot of isolation and there's a lot of high turnover. So self-care, I have done a lot of training on self-care. I have talked to all, and usually what you get is, yeah, I got it. Okay, let's just kind of scoot through that. We don't have an option right now. Self-care is not optional. We have an ethical responsibility for self-care. And I think it's Virginia Association of Nurses did a webinar on self-care, and they called it something like extreme care for extreme measures. And they were saying, this is so important. There is a lot of focus on care, self-care throughout the healthcare industry right now. And so it's very important that top-down support, to have top-down support. If you are a manager, if you are a leader, then you want to make sure that you are supporting your people and you are encouraging them to do self-care. And one size does not fit all. It really, everybody has a different thing that's meaningful to them. And so what we're, and you know, self-care is not about bubble baths and, you know, and massages, although that might be what is your lane, but it's really about creating new habits. And what that does, it helps us focus on the present moment. It creates meaning and memories. It reminds us of what's important. It also reduces anxiety and helps us have more well-being. And it offers a predictable sense of structure. So if we start finding whatever it is, and if we start finding whatever it is that really is, that brings us peace, that helps us get centered, then if we put it like a ritual, we develop a habit, we do it over and over, we make sure that we prioritize it, it really helps provide structure, it helps us have a better sense of well-being. And it's really important because if we don't pour back into ourselves, we can't serve others, because we can't serve from an empty vessel. And so a lot of times people, because, you know, if you're in the healthcare industry, you care about people. Nobody does this if they don't care about people. But if you won't do it for yourself, and oftentimes that comes at a price to ourselves, but if you won't do it for yourself, then do it for the people that you care about, and because you can't serve from an empty vessel. So we all need to be pouring in. And even though I'm not on the front lines the way other people are, I'm finding myself needing to have much more focus on self-care to keep myself centered and to keep myself able to support the team here, as well as the, you know, our families and my volunteers and my own personal family. Ellen went over a lot of these things, so I'm not going to go over them again, but one of the things I do want to focus on are the two in the center, which are feel your feelings and have fun. So let's start with feel your feelings. We need to learn how to emotionally regulate. Emotional regulation is really important at this time. So we need to feel what we feel. We want to make sure that we are not, that we're not numbing everything. That we're not numbing everything. So feel what you feel, push through it, but don't keep stuffing because it's going to come back. The other is try to have fun. You know, I think right now it's like, how do we have fun? Well, find ways to laugh, find ways to do things that give you joy. We'll talk about that in just a minute in terms of some of the things that we offered our team here, but just have fun. And I know that sounds trite and silly, but it has, you know, we could go into all the therapeutic benefits of that. So I want to talk about what we've done here at Sentara Hospice. And because our volunteer services are suspended, the ones in the home, our direct patient volunteer services are suspended, I've spent a lot of my time trying to develop programs for our staff. We have great top-down support. Our administrator is very, very strong about, she's very, very focused on what we call compassion fatigue. And most of you have heard the expression, but it really is getting worn out from being compassionate all the time. And we've been particularly kind of vigilant about making sure that our staff is well taken care of. So the objective was to provide holistic, multifaceted support for our staff, that we wanted to provide a holistic approach to it. We didn't want to do just one type of thing. And so the goals were, we wanted to focus on communication, appreciation, community, and self-care. One of the first things we did, and there's a picture down in the corner, we put together a COVID survival kit. We had some lunch boxes. We put, some of the things were practical, some of the things were silly. We did toilet paper because everybody was looking for toilet paper. We put soap. We put earplugs so you could social distance from your family at home. There were snacks and chips, and we put a rubber band on there so people could be flexible. There was water, there was chocolate, because of course it's got to have chocolate. One of the things we did, and so we gave those to all of our team members. The next thing we did, and we tried to do it kind of like once a week, once every 10 days, I asked all of my volunteers if they would write notes to our staff. And one volunteer took me up on it, and she hand wrote notes of encouragement to our entire staff. We mailed them to the home. We wanted them not to be just something else we put in their box. And I got to tell you, I had seasoned hospice nurses. I mean, and hospice nurses are, they are used to dealing with some really tough situations. I had seasoned hospice nurses calling me in tears about how much that meant to them, how this person had taken that time. And so Ellen talked about the handwritten notes she got earlier. I cannot tell you how much that meant to this particular group of people. And I mean, that was just so impactful. And so we also did a thing called press the pause button. And that was it was kind of rituals. What we were trying to do is give people self-care rituals. And if any of you want those rituals, I can send those to you. And we put those in with a coloring book and a couple of other things. We increased our huddle, which is our daily, our phone call, to twice daily, once in the morning, once in the evening. We gave them homemade masks. There was a goodie bag. We delivered lunch out in the field. We had, at our team meeting, we took time at the end. We have a weekly meeting. Hospice is required to have that every week for all the disciplines to be there. So our chaplain provided messages of encouragement, and we also gave people time to process if they had anything they wanted to talk about. So we also had, there's a work sponsored exercise contest that we've all decided we have a team. So, a lot of this is really, as I was putting this together and the organizers, we were all talking about this, the humans, we wanted to end on hope, because so much of this is is it discouraging, depressing? I'm not quite sure, but really the thing that has been encouraging to me is this slide of the human spirit is stronger than anything that can happen to it. So it's been really wonderful to watch. It's been very encouraging to me to watch people kind of pivot and do workarounds and come up with creative ideas about how to meet these needs that we've identified through our research and through all of our years in practice. And it really is, what we've seen is the human spirit. It's very, very strong. And so how I want to end is I want to encourage us to, what do we want to bring with us? Both personally and professionally. I think anytime that we go through a challenging period, we want to identify, like, what are the lessons? What do we want to bring with us in terms of what are the things we want to do differently, both good and bad? And that happens personally as well as professionally. So my last slide is the two really important resources that are really easy for you to access. Is the white paper I was telling you about, death, grief, and funerals in the COVID age. And also Hospice Foundation of America has done free COVID webinars. They've been doing them all through the spring. As far as recent as last week, they were still available. And so these resources are there. And my email address is there. And if you want to email me, I can send you the presentation. I'll be happy to do that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we're going to see Karen for questions.
Okay. Wow, is what I have to say. That was amazing. So thought-provoking. Yes. You have several questions that are waiting for you. The first one, how do you become a thanatologist?
Actually, it's very interesting, because I was in a class in VCU in gerontology, and someone spoke in that class and they were a thanatologist. And I decided at that moment I wanted to get my certification. And the way that you get it is through the Association for Death, Education, and Counseling. It's called ADEC. It's the Association for Death, Education, and Counseling. And they have a certification program where you can become a certified thanatologist. I don't know what the new guidelines are, but at the time that I took the test, got my initial certification is you have to take, have a certain amount of hours in the field. You have to have a certain amount of education, and a lot of my programs at VCU counted for that. So I didn't have to get any extra education. And then you have to take a test based on 4 different textbooks. So you have to pass an exam. So those are the 3 things. And then you have to be recertified every 3 years. So I've had, I'm on my 3rd recertification, I think. So.
Wow. Someone just wanted to know if that is how that differs from being a death doula.
A death doula is a very different program. The main thanatology is really more of the big picture of death, dying, and bereavement. A lot of the kinds of things we talked about today. As I understand it, and I've never done the death doula program, it is more directly related to walking an individual through the dying process, from diagnosis, terminal diagnosis, through the dying process, both the family and the loved one and the family. They are not they're not a replacement for hospice care, but death doulas are more of a kind of a great addition to hospice care. So and there's different people that provide death doula training. ELDERHO is one of the most prominent ones and most well-known ones.
Great. Please share your last slide once again.
Okay, let's see.
With the resources. And if you can't do that right now, we can get back to that. Okay, there you go.
Got it?
Yeah. Great. I think we can continue with a few more while that's on our screen.
Okay.
Okay. This is a very interesting question, and actually one of mine. What new practices do you think will continue once the pandemic is over?
I think we're going to see a lot of, I think we're going to see a lot of technology being used. I think technology, I think we're going to see in person. I think people are going to be really eager to get back into the in-person, care. But I also think we're going to see a lot of use of technology. I think that we're going to see the funeral industry change probably as much as anything. I think that we're going to be able to supplement, and I'm going to speak, I think, from the hospice arena. We can supplement what we do with technology, but I think that we will still be focused on more bedside, more one-on-one care. But I think a lot of the creative, I think that especially now we have permission to do things different ways and different is to really keep utilizing some of those creative things that people have developed.
Great. Okay. How do we address all of the collective grief that we're experiencing right now across the globe?
I think that, and I referred to that a little bit when I talked about it, I think that we're going to have to beef up our support. We're going to have to beef up our ability to identify grief in different settings and what that looks like. And I'm sure, and I'm not a grief specialist, but I'm sure that there are, I was talking to a counselor the other day, and she said after 9/11, she was practicing in DC, and she said she was using a lot of the trauma-based therapy that she used back during 9/11 with some of her clients now going through COVID. So I think we're probably going to have to draw from some of those practices, the more trauma-informed practices, to address the grief. And also really think about manpower and how that's going to be delivered, because it's not just a matter of what techniques are we going to use, but are there going to be enough grief resources available out in the community?
Okay. The last question that I see, at least for right now, is how do I support someone who is grieving?
I get that question a lot, and it's kind of the same. It's kind of the same way that you support someone who is dying, and part of it is being normal. I think one thing that's really, really important that we all recognize is that there's no magic combination of words that is going to change how somebody grieves. I think that, you know, we're all looking for that magic thing to say to make somebody feel better, to take their pain away. And there's not a magic combination. And I think in a lot of ways, we, the things we say make it worse, like heaven needed another angel, or they're in a better place. Or, you know, my friend who lost her husband looked at me and said, what do you mean they're in a better place? Is there a better place than being here with me? And so I think we want to be careful about using platitudes. And the other thing, and just say, gosh, I don't know what that feels like, but I'm here for you. I'm here for you. The other is letting them tell their story, because we think that if you mention the person's name that has passed away, it's going to make the bereaved, the loved one, feel worse. Actually, what makes them feel worse is where you don't say their name and you act like really nervous about, you know, oh my gosh, what if I mention their name? I'm going to make them think about their loved one. Well, they're thinking about their loved one anyway. We just don't know that. And so really to say, hey, you know, I was with a friend recently who had lost her husband 3 years ago, and we were watching a movie and I was like, hey, do you think Charles would have liked this movie? I mean, did he like this kind of comedy? And so we talked about it. And so really let people tell their stories, let them talk about their loved one. If they need to tell you the story over and over and over again, listen, just sit and listen and say things like, tell me more about that. Or, wow, that must've really been hard. And just not try to fix it. And just be there, show up, drop by, text them, write them notes, just, hey, I'm thinking about you. Hey, I'm going to get ice cream. You want to go? That kind of thing. So, yeah.
So this next question relates to technology, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. So many do not have computer access and knowledge. They may not have family or kids to teach them, did not know how to use computers before COVID. They are at a disadvantage similar to children who are suddenly forced to do remote learning without the tools.
No question.
Some of the financial variables come into play. Can you please speak to this?
I don't know that I can speak to that, because I don't know that I've seen how people are delivering that. I think one of the things that Ellen was talking about is being able to provide technology for people. I think there's probably people, there's organizations out there who can address some of that. I don't know that I haven't heard of us in particular trying to address that need specifically. So I can get back to them. I don't have a good answer for that, really, unfortunately.
Okay. Moving on. If family members of loved ones take necessary precautions, such as being tested and wearing PPE, do you think the feelings might change in a facility about visiting their dying loved one?
I think that we're going to see things evolve, and I think we've already seen things evolve. Now, part of the challenge is, and to be candid, is that, and Jenny, I think it was Jenny that referenced this, is the lack of PPE, particularly in long-term care. So if the long-term care is already short on PPE for their staff, they're not going to be able to provide PPE for families. And so, but I think that we're going to see a loosening up. We've already seen a loosening up of that. We've seen some of our facilities let family members come in a couple at a time. But I think that we're going to see a loosening of that. But yeah, I mean, conceivably, yes, in a perfect world, I think that they will be more open but right now if you look at the numbers, nursing homes and long-term care facilities are so nervous about COVID getting in their facility, because in that close proximity, it spreads so quickly. You've got staff coming in and out of rooms. And so it's going to be hard to make those, you know, there's that yin and yang. We saw that being weighed, and really infection control and keeping people alive is really critical. And yeah, it's a tough one.
Another question, what resources would you recommend for exploring the cross-section of gerontology and end-of-life or hospice?
I'm not sure what the question is about resource. I mean, is it resources as a professional, resources as a, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I'm actually just reading it.
I know you are, I know you are. Well, one of the things that, when I was in the gerontology program, one of the things, I knew I wanted to work in end of life. And so gerontology really gave me such a great background for this work. I also wanted to layer on top of it some kind of certification that gave me additional credibility. And so if it's from a professional standpoint, I think kind of tying those two together, which is, you know, having the certification in thanatology and gerontology and having my master's in gerontology.
Yeah, so the individual that submitted that question was, her reference was as a professional.
Yeah, okay.
Okay,
So,
okay. Does anyone else have any other questions? Because that sums up what we've received thus far.
okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. All right, well, we're gonna wrap up today's webinar. And the very first thing that I would like to do is thank Jenny, Ellen, and Enid for amazing presentations and updating us with such important information. It's been a great afternoon of learning and sharing, and all of us at JFS, the VCU Department of Gerontology, and Mark and Alex Goodstein at Wells Fargo Financial Advisors, thank you for being with us today. We thank all of our participants who've joined us today, representing multiple states across the United States. And today, we've opened up important conversations that we hope will be beneficial to your work and daily lives as we endure this pandemic. If you would like to reach out to our speakers, we've listed their email addresses on your screen and have placed them in your chat box. My address is also listed on this screen, as JFS would appreciate your feedback on today's webinar and answer any questions you may have had about our programs. We wish everyone good health, patience, and hope. And until next time, take care.